Hello, hello, and welcome back to a Beatles talk show podcast called Things We Said Today. We do this every 2 weeks here on our YouTube channel and all the audio platforms that we're on. I'm Ken Michaels, one of the three regular co-hosts of the show, known for my syndicated Beatles radio show called Every Little Thing, another talk show podcast on the solo Beatles called Talk More Talk, and I have my own YouTube channel on the Beatles and it's just called Ken Michaels Radio. And I'm being joined by my two regulars here, Alan Kozinn, who you know for his many years working at the New York Times in the classical department, writing several Beatle books, including From the Cavern to the Rooftop and Got That Something, How I Want to Hold Your Hand Changed Everything, and also most recently, the McCartney Legacy Volume 1, and a book we're going to be talking about on this show with Alan's co-author, Adrian Sinclair. Hello, Alan. The McCartney Legacy Volume 2 gets the spotlight this time.
Hey Ken, great to be here.
And of course, we have Darren Devivo with us for many years, for 40 plus years, manning the fort at New York's WFUV and putting on lots of great shows, occasionally some Beatles specials too. He's always been a welcome addition to the show for the many years he's been on here now. Darren, hi. How you doing?
Hey Ken, hi Alan. Happy holidays, everyone. Happy Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy New Year. Today's going to be a special show, final one for the year.
That's right. And why not end the year with a special show by talking about one of the biggest events of the year, and that is the McCartney Legacy Volume 2 being released.
Mhm.
That was on December the 10th. It's been highly anticipated for the last 2 years. And as I said before, Alan will be joined, as we all are, with Adrian Sinclair over in England. We're going to be talking to him. Okay, but before we do that, we have the latest in Beatle news. And we actually begin with the sad news on the passing of music producer Richard Perry, who, among Beatle fans, will best be known for two albums he produced for Ringo, which were Ringo's two most successful commercially, the Ringo album from 1973 and the follow-up to Ringo, Goodnight Vienna. But it wasn't the first time Perry worked with Ringo, as he arranged the title track to Ringo's very first solo album he made, which was comprised of standards from the pre-rock era, Sentimental Journey. Perry produced albums and hits for some of the biggest names in the business: Barbra Streisand, Harry Nilsson, Carly Simon, Neil Diamond, the Pointer Sisters, Art Garfunkel, Diana Ross, Andy Williams, and Rod Stewart. Ringo had a string of 7 top 10 hits in the first part of the 70s, and 5 of those were produced by Perry, who became one of the most successful producers in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In 2021, Perry released the book Cloud Nine: Memoirs of a Record Producer. The year 2024 could be remembered as a year that we lost two of pop music's greatest producers, with Perry and Quincy Jones passing away this year. Perry had Parkinson's disease and he died from cardiac arrest. He died on December 24th and he was 82. Very sad to hear that news. I haven't heard a comment from Ringo about this, surprisingly. He usually says
Yeah.
peace and love to Richard Perry and his family. Nothing yet. I won't be surprised if he does, probably in the next few days, maybe. We'll see. Of utmost concern, there is upsetting news on the health of Julian Lennon. Almost 5 years ago, Julian had a cancerous mole removed from his head, and he recently had emergency surgery to remove another cancerous mole. Julian traveled from Los Angeles to New York to do some promotion for his new book of photos called Life's Fragile Moments when he received a message from his dermatologist with some urgency to return to LA. He says he had two locations on his skin, shoulder and forearm, one of which was melanoma, which had to be operated on immediately. Julian says the operation was a success, but he won't know the results of the biopsy until after the holidays. He is urging his fans to be checked out by a doctor because it may end up saving your life. On Facebook, he wrote, I cannot tell you how I felt from one moment of joy to the fear of feeling that I may be gone at any given moment. I'm still shaking inside, but my faith is strong. He says, life is too short. Don't make it shorter by being ignorant about your own health. Love to all. Prayers going out to Julian, who just recently did a 2-hour interview, which you can catch on Joe Rogan's podcast, where he talks about this. Some positive news. Nice to switch that over on the health of Joey Molen, who's been hospitalized in and out of ICU for complications with diabetes. His girlfriend, Mary Joyce, just posted on Facebook, progress is steady this week. Confusion is abating, and he is starting slowly to walk short distances. His appetite is off the charts. Mentally, he is sharper, and that will improve, especially when he has moved on from the hospital to a rehabilitation center. Not sure what the future holds, but he is here, and he's working hard to stay here for a long time. So he's not out of the woods just yet, but send prayers his way as well for him and for Julian. Paul McCartney posted his New Year's resolution on his website in his You Gave Me the Answer column. He says, here's one, finish an album. I've been working on a lot of songs and I've had to put it to the side because of the tour. So I'm hoping to get back into that and finish up a lot of these songs. So how's about that? My New Year's resolution is to finish a new album. How's about that for a teaser? Well, that would make my year. Been waiting for a new album from Paul since McCartney 3. And Paul ended his Got Back tour with a bang, giving a concert at the O2 Arena in London, where Ringo Starr reunited with him on stage and joined him and the band for Sergeant Pepper and Helter Skelter. When he arrived on stage, Ringo said, I've had a great night tonight. It's been a great show. When leaving the stage, he said, I'm off now. I've had a great night and I love you all. Ron Wood also joined McCartney and band on stage for Get Back, and it was also a reunion for Paul and his first Hofner bass, which he played on stage after it was found after so many years of being lost. More news here. There's a new video that was created for Whatever Gets You Through the Night. The live recording of that, Elton John and John Lennon. It's made up of still photos of the two superstars, both on stage together and in the studio. Very nicely done, which you should check out if you can. The February issue of Mojo magazine has the Rolling Stones on the front cover with an article on Ringo's new country album, Look Up. Thanks to Fred Velez on that. Um, the new issue of Songwriter magazine has an interview with Ringo in it, which we're ordering here, and hopefully I'll be getting in a week or two. The new issue of Record Collector is out. You've heard me talk about this. This is the new issue on John and Yoko. It covers John's full discography, as they also cover Yoko's as well. Julian and Sean are covered. And this is the same magazine that 1 year ago put out an excellent issue on Paul McCartney's solo career. So when I'm done with the McCartney Legacy Vol.2, this will be among the next things that I'll be reading. But it is out there from Record Collector, that issue on John and Yoko. David Bedford's new book, What If? We have a new date for that coming out, is March the 2nd, covering all the what ifs in Beatle history. What if George Martin hadn't been their producer? What if Pete Best stayed with the band? On and on and on. That's what the book covers. The new movie Sonic the Hedgehog 3 features the Traveling Wilbury song End of the Line. Thank you, Scott O'Rourke, for that information. A big event that's been happening every year in Florida is Beatles on the Beach. It's in Delray Beach. It'll be happening March the 6th through the 9th with special performers Night Ranger and Tony Kishman, who you may have heard of. He has a McCartney tribute band called Live and Let Die, The Paul McCartney Experience. For more information about this, it's mainly a lot of tribute bands performing. Beatles tribute bands, and sometimes interviews as well. But you can go to BeatlesOnTheBeach.com. All right. Wonderful Christmas Time from Paul McCartney re-entered Billboard's Hot 100 last week at number 46, moves up to number 39. I guess that means Paul has another top 40 hit. McCartney 2 is at number 179 on the charts. Clever thing that Paul did to make Wonderful Christmas Time a song on McCartney 2, because that keeps reappearing almost every single year for a week or two on Billboard's album charts. In the UK, Wonderful Christmas Time moves from 18 to 16 on their official singles charts, while Happy Christmas War is Over moves up from 29 to 24. So both Paul and John are on the British charts. Here in America, so far, it's only Paul. Reminder, Ringo's new album, Look Up, comes out January 10th, and Ringo performs at the Ryman Theater in Nashville. That's January 14th and 15th. And that's all the news we have for you right now.
And guess who's going to be at the Ryman? You.
That's right. I will be. Yes.
And so Ken will have a report of those. You're going to both shows?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So
And
we'll have a report on the two shows.
and you'll find out about that probably in our next show, unless I do a live report, maybe. Who knows?
Mhm. The plans are to turn that into a special television
Yes, I
special.
think there's a TV special in the works for it, and I'm just curious to find out how many songs from the new album he's going to do. You
He
know,
won't do any.
it's the
I'm
same songs
kidding.
that he does with the All-Stars, but with a country twist to it.
He'll do Anthem. I'm just kidding. Kidding.
He did say he was going to do With a Little Help from My Friends, but with a country slant to it.
Okay.
Okay, so that's all the
He could do the
news.
new album on the first half and Buku's of Blues on the second half. Just look,
I'd be
see.
thrilled if he did. He should just do a show of songs from Buku of Blues, Look Up, and all the country styled songs he's done in his solo career, because he has them sprinkled out over many of his solo albums.
Right.
So there you go. There you have all the news for the moment. And as promised, we have a very special show in store for you right now. We have the two authors of the brand new book, The McCartney Legacy, Vol.2. One of those authors you should know pretty well because he's one of our regular co-hosts of the show. Alan Kozinn and Adrian Sinclair collaborated with Alan on this book, which picks up where Volume 1 left off with the success of Band on the Run and takes you through the end of the 70s up to Paul's drug bust in Japan. So welcome, Adrian, and of course, you too, Alan.
Thanks for having me. I can't believe it's been 2 years since I was last on your show.
Well,
Blimey, time
Volume
flies.
1
And
was 2 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
So that's
Yeah.
fine.
But it doesn't seem like it's been 2 years between the two books, though. But I guess it has, right?
Yeah, it's been a busy 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Congratulations, Adrian, and well, Alan, of course, on this book. I've been reading some incredible comments on it on social media and reviews and whatnot, and so this has been well worth the wait. And the McCartney Legacy is going to wrap up for us here at Things We Said Today, 2024, and there'll be a part two to this chat, which will be our first show for 2025.
All right.
So welcome, Adrian, and it's a little weird talking to Alan as a guest.
But
You
it
should
got
just
me out of
abuse it.
hosting.
We'll have to be nice to Alan, Ken.
No, we abuse it more. I think so. But I was telling Darren and Alan before we started bringing you on here that this is not a book that I can just bounce around in. I have to go page by page because you never know what you're going to find out, some tidbit of information you never knew before. And I've said this, I think, about the first book and in Mark Lewison's work especially, that you kind of feel like you're living with Paul McCartney because everything is all chronological day by day. And it's really amazing when you think about it, when you go to each page here and you know whatever sessions took place that day, even if it's over dubbing a song or something, you have all that information and it's truly remarkable. I mean, how do you discover all that stuff, all these songs, when they were recorded? And even if you go back to how did you even know? I know in the case of Paul, and this is probably something common with a lot of artists. There's so many songs that he started writing years before he released it. And as I'm reading this book, I'm discovering for the first time that he's writing the words to London Town while he's starting writing for Wings at the Speed of Sound, and Don't Let It Bring You Down was also written around that time. There's so many songs like that appear years later in McCartney's catalog, but how do you discover all that information?
Well, it's the old cliche, isn't it, really? But we've been working on these two volumes side by side for 10 years. And throughout that period, you're just picking up more and more pieces of this jigsaw as you go through that time. Um, and we had a lot of session paperwork, and we were helped a great deal during this period by some of the recording engineers. For example, Peter Henderson, who did the Wings at the Speed of Sound sessions, he kept a diary. And your jaws are gonna drop when I tell you this information. But he said he volunteered this information to NPL when they re-released Wings at the Speed of Sound, and they didn't use any of it. So there you go. He basically just sent me a chronology of everything they did from this little session log he had, and he
Right.
probably kept that book so that he knew. Well, if you're working with Paul McCartney, you document your life, obviously, but most engineers just kept a session log to keep a document of what monies they were owed. But yeah, throughout that 10-year period, we just found, all of this information and like you say, brought it all together, including, when certain songs were composed that were perhaps not recorded during that time. And information like that would frequently come out during interviews we'd find, from the time. So Paul would be doing an interview, say, in Australia during the tour in 1975, and he'd tell the journalists, "Oh, Linda and I wrote a song yesterday." And it was just me describing what was around us in the kitchen, and that obviously was Cook of the House. So we
Right.
could definitively nail down the precise date that Paul wrote Cook of the House. In the same way, we found out the date that he wrote Girls' School, because I was fascinated with finding the exact newspaper Paul read when he found the name of all the pornographic films that he just plucked from the page. So we found that the Honolulu Advertiser, or whatever it was, and we circled all of the ads in there. So we knew, probably within a day the precise date that Paul wrote Girls' School. But yeah, it really was just for Alan and I a very, very long research period of 10 years that culminated in the 1,500 pages that we've written for these first two volumes.
Hmm. Have you been able to either read or hear or watch probably every interview that Paul's done in this period? Or were there times when you discovered that there were interviews that you had no way of accessing at all? I'm
It's
just curious because,
you can't really say everyone because we don't know what ones we don't know about, but
right.
we've got thousands of them, and that's it. It covers that period pretty well, and also we continue collecting them up to this day. I mean, I always have, and so that I had no idea that I was going to eventually write a Paul McCartney book or
Mm.
two or four. Was just collecting this stuff, and it sort of complements the stuff that Adrian got in his researches, because you know, for me, I'm just getting it in real time as it's going on, but the early period that the first two books covered, I didn't have that much, because I was either a kid or
Mm.
not, not collecting in that way yet, and there was no internet. That has made things quite easy. Um, but I make things quite easy, but it's nothing like going to the British Museum because they have every newspaper and magazine ever published in the known universe, So, we sort of need both. And also, collectors have lots of stuff, and some of it's not all bootlegs or tapes. I mean, sometimes people have paperwork, and that's been handy too. But
Hmm.
interviews we might not have. I mean, I can't think of any that we've heard about and tried to find and couldn't find. So if there are ones we've missed, there are ones we also haven't heard about, and we've heard about an awful lot of them.
Hmm.
And it seems to me that given the number of interviews we have in the archive, um, it's unlikely that there's this one interview where he gives the key to all of reality and we didn't find that one. You know what I mean? So we feel we're pretty well covered.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, Ken, some of the most interesting ones, believe it or not, were things that would turn up on eBay. So, I have an eBay search every day for, Paul McCartney, any magazine or newspaper that might be for sale in the known universe. And occasionally these magazines would pop up that were from the sort of mid 70s, where Paul and Linda would maybe do an interview with, like a women's publication. Um, and, some of those interviews can, probably contain some of the most interesting quotes from Paul and Linda, because, often when they spoke with the music press, uh, they were a little guarded in the things that they said. But when they were talking with journalists from, like you say, fashion magazines and things like that, they were a little bit more open when they were talking about their lives. So, some of the more candid comments maybe come from some of those magazines that we found on eBay and sourced at great expense.
Well, you're probably going to get a lot of different questions in those kind of magazines than
That's
what
right.
the press will ask.
Right.
So, going back to volume one, you were very fortunate to have access to Denny Seiwell, his diaries with his wife Monique. So you had the diaries of Jeff Britton to work with. He kept a diary every day.
Yeah, he still does, I think, to this day. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
And you
yeah.
also,
I mean, it's a strange one because I met with Jeff. I think it was in 2019, it's just before the pandemic,
yeah.
and we met over in Spain where he lives now. And he'd not really done many interviews since about 1977. I think he'd done a couple in Nashville, perhaps a year earlier, and that's how I managed to get in contact with him. It was through Dan Ely, actually,
Hmm.
who would be very well known by McCartney fans.
Right.
So Dan Ely connected me with Jeff, and we sat and had a conversation in a cafe bar for about 2 or 3 hours. And, it was a difficult conversation for Jeff, really revisiting the past after all that time. And it was the first in-depth interview he'd given in nearly, 45 plus years. But we got on really well. And, then strangely, the world kind of went into meltdown 4 or 5 months later.
Hmm.
And we went into lockdown in March. And Jeff contacted me to say that he'd found his diaries from this period, and is that something that would be helpful for us? And we sat and we did a few Zoom conversations and we talked about what was going on in the world. And then he'd basically, drift through what was going on with Wings at the same time. So, a lot of the dates and details for, Nashville, for example, is almost a day for day account of what was happening there. That's all from Jeff's diaries. The day that Paul and the band went to see Professor Longhair in New Orleans, that's from Jeff. So, a lot of that information, is thanks to Jeff and his foresight to document his time in Wings and then hold on to those diaries to this day. So,
Any reason why he's been reticent all these years to talk about that time? Was it a good time in his life or was it more painful?
well, I mean, you'll see when you read the book that, when he left the band, he was in the middle of getting divorced as well. And then he arrived back in England to find that his car had been stolen from Heathrow Airport. So it was like anything that could go wrong did go wrong, really. And yeah, I mean, Jeff made a couple of attempts to get back into music around that time, but then he kind of withdrew from the scene for a few years because he found it too difficult. But yeah, I think really what it came down to, and it's something that he would bring up quite regularly in interviews, was he gave an interview, I think it was in 1977, where he said something about Jimmy and he was misquoted, and that just didn't go down very well with him, really.
Hmm.
Um, I've not actually heard Jeff's thoughts on the book yet. He hasn't read it yet. But I get the feeling it's going to be quite a difficult read for Jeff, really, given that it goes into so much detail about his tenure in the band and how he was kind of given the boot in a pretty underhand way, really. And but yeah, I hope that in some way it maybe gives him a little bit of closure, all these years later.
Right.
I know One Hand Clapping is doing a great job and showing a lot of people what a great drummer he was. He was a powerhouse. And that album now being out and the film being out can only raise his reputation.
Mhm.
Um, I had found one of the things I think maybe it was the first thing he did after Wings was a band called, if I'm not mistaken, was it Rough Diamond? I think he was in a band. I stumbled upon a record by this group one day and something made me take it out of the bin in the store and look on the back cover, and there's Jeff Britton, one of the band members. I believe it was Rough Diamond was the band's name, and they did one self-titled album. I forget who else was in the group. I think somebody from Uriah Heep or something.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, he did a couple of things. So I'm just pulling up my folder here. Actually, I have a folder for every member of Wings and what they did afterwards. I can't recite this from memory, but yeah, he did do a single in 1976 under his own name,
Oh, really?
but spelt wrong. So it was spelt Jeff, Jeff, Jeff Britton and the Spitfires, and they did a single called Rub Out, which
Oh,
was
wow.
actually used on a Nissan commercial in the early 2000s. They sampled that. And if you can find a copy of that, it's as rare as hen's teeth. Uh, and then he did Rough Diamond in 77.
Right.
And he had another band in the 80s called The Keys, who were massive in Japan. And they still have a really big cult following in Japan. And that album by The Keys is absolutely fantastic. If you can get hold of a copy of that album, The Keys by The Keys, it's absolutely brilliant.
Hmm.
Writing
Okay.
all that down.
I do want to address something that was at the very beginning of the book concerning the Beatles. And it's something that I've been kind of curious about. We all know that John Lennon was the final signature to dissolve the Beatles in Disney World, the end of 1974. And the other three met in New York and they were waiting for John to sign and he didn't show up.
Mhm.
Why was it John kept hesitating to do this? Considering the fact that he was the one who said, I want a divorce from the Beatles. He was the one who initiated the breakup of the Beatles. And yet, you know, nothing happened until the end of 1974. I know you bring up there's a tax situation, a problem involved, but was any of it more of an emotional thing that maybe he didn't want to break ties completely? I mean, what did you get from that in discovering that?
Uh, that was pretty much, I think, May's feeling, who was there at the time that he signed finally, and that whole period leading up to it. Um, her feeling was sort of that, it's one thing to say that you want to break up the group, but if you were also the one who started the group and went through all of that with them, to actually follow through on being the one finally to put on the last signature and break it up, was apparently difficult for him, much as he wanted it, and he did want it. But it was just, if you look at asking for the extra million and all this stuff, he's dragging his feet about, almost everything. And part of that is because he wants to make sure that he doesn't walk away with the least because of his tax problems, etc. He wants to walk away still living in the style to which he's accustomed, and uh, wanted to see to that. But of course, that's why he has lawyers. Um, but he kept instructing the lawyers to ask for this or ask for that, or make sure about the tax thing or whatever. And in a way, those are probably completely legitimate and real concerns, but they were also excuses to sort of let him drag his feet more. And
Yeah.
and finally he did it. And there's I don't know if you've seen, well, I know you've seen May's Instamatic book, where she actually has a picture of him signing the contract. And it
Right.
apparently was a very sort of emotional moment.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Okay. Let me pass you over to Darren. I have loads of other questions, but
I get the impression, and we probably had a similar discussion when the first volume was out, that in writing these books, and you alluded to this, Adrian, that you weren't sitting down writing in chronological order, but a full picture spectrum of McCartney's career and life, and filling in pieces as those pieces came, uh, across your desk. So I would imagine puzzle pieces are in place for 1980 and forward for the future volumes as well, correct?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously we've been working on these first two books, uh, which cover the 1970s and the start of 1980. But we've got material that takes us all the way through to present day.
Right. So it's
Um,
all in place to begin when it's time to focus on the next volume. We've
that's
already
right.
got this material in place to start with.
Yeah, what we need to do is to do more of what we call the processing work, which is
Right.
the kind of boring uh, process stuff, where we kind of put this stuff all into timeline documents and things that to most people would be incredibly boring, but to Alan and I are like the backbones of the book. So for each volume, we have these timeline documents, and then we have separate timelines for other things. Like we had an Apple legal timeline, and
Mhm.
I wrote a separate document just for the US tour in 1976, which I think is 200 pages long, and it has every single review of every concert and everything that happened during that tour. So we'd need to do a similar thing for 1980. Um, Approaching the third volume is going to be very different, I think, to the first two, given that we're going to be documenting the whole of the 1980s in one book. So how that's going to affect our approach is very hard to say until we come to writing the thing. What pieces of information do you keep, and what pieces of information do you take out in order to get it into something that's a similar size as those first two books, which is what our publisher will be looking for.
Right.
Um, but you can guarantee when we finish volume three that it will be, the most that's ever been written about Paul McCartney in the 1980s.
Right. I would imagine, though, that volume is going to have very, very little on live performance, obviously, um, with no tours until the later in 1989, and
Yeah.
that I would think, theoretically affect the way the third book re comes together and the way it reads, because it's mostly going to be studio and other type work with a very little on touring schedules and whatnot.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. And Alan and I, when we were putting together volume two particularly, we found that the most difficult chapters to compile were the tours, because we wanted them to be engaging. We didn't want them to just read like a bunch of reviews one after another,
Mhm.
and then they rolled into Chicago and then they rolled into Los Angeles. We felt that that would be really boring for readers. So we were very fortunate to engage some of the guys who worked for Shoko on the 1976, and 75 tour, in fact. Um, so, when you read the chapters about Wings over America and the European tours in 75 and 76, we wanted to make sure that at every date you went away learning something new about that date. Like there's a great story where they were invited to go and immortalize that. I think it was their handprints at a local record store, and they couldn't make it. So they sent a flatbed truck down to the stadium where they were performing, and all five members of the band immortalized their handprints in concrete, out in a flatbed truck outside the gig. So it was just these little stories we felt would be interesting for readers who know that tour itinerary like the back of their hands, because they've obviously, people who pick up our books aren't casual Paul McCartney fans, are they really? So
No.
we wanted even the most hardened McCartney fan to learn something new about every date on that tour.
Well, I think I could speak for Ken when I say, as two hardcore McCartney fans from when we were both this big, there's on almost every page there's something. And for me personally, because I grew up in the 70s and Wings provided me with the soundtrack, my soundtrack growing up, finding out the behind the scenes, fly on the wall type stories behind the songs that I remember hearing on AM radio when I was a kid. It's special.
Mm.
Um, I also would imagine that you guys wrote one and now two. You both probably had your eyes opened many times with facts and information that you had no idea happened, or maybe events that you knew about that you didn't think you were going to get any details on, but you did. Is it possible to give us a couple of examples of eye-opening things that you learned in writing these two books?
Sure. Um, I didn't know that he almost died in Hawaii on that trip. It was mentioned in Hawaiian newspapers, but I didn't somehow subscribe to those. And that story hasn't gotten out all that much. I mean, there are probably people who've heard about it, but and that was a pretty dramatic moment. I mean, he could actually have died, when in this sort of swimming body surfing accident, um, after he was told not to go swimming after a storm. Um, let's see, the Isaac Asimov and the follow-up with Eugene Roddenberry. I didn't really know very much about that, and we ended up getting the screenplay or the treatment, Paul's treatment, and then Asimov's treatment. We don't have a treatment from Roddenberry, but we have an idea of basically Paul was still trying to get Roddenberry to do his script ideas that he had brought to Asimov. So the idea of Paul commissioning a sci-fi movie for Wings to appear in was new to me.
I can pick up with the second part of that. I was just going to say the great thing about the Asimov story was that it was one of those things that kind of fans had spoken about in forums, about this Asimov project, and it was mentioned in one of Asimov's memoirs that he'd done this project with McCartney, but there were no details available for what it was that they'd actually worked on together. So I did a little bit of detective work and found that Asimov left his archives in a university in Boston. So I called them up, and it turns out that his treatment and Paul's treatment and various other bits of pieces of paperwork were still there. And we were incredibly lucky because it was during the pandemic, so I couldn't fly to Boston, but they volunteered to scan all that paperwork for us, and they sent it through. So, then we like I said, it was another piece of the jigsaw. It was something we'd heard speculation about this project with Asimov, but to be able to give some concrete details and information about it, it kind of was a real eye opener for both of us. And it seems to be, since the book came out, one of the biggest kind of press stories from the book, actually. I think there's been about 20 different news articles written about the Paul McCartney sci-fi movie that never was. Um,
Wow.
but who knows? Maybe now he's shelved his other project. It's a Wonderful Life. Maybe he's going back to the sci-fi project. Who knows?
Those
It's
guys kicked up the
disappointing.
dust on this thing. Now I have to finish it.
It's kind of disappointing all the projects that Paul starts that don't get finished. Or I'm grateful we got the Bruce McMouse show and the Red Rose Speedway box set and everything, but um I'm about halfway done with the book so far. But do you explain why Rupert the Bear, the full-length film, was never finished?
We do, in a way. There is a discussion with Steve Hawley, who had been talking to Linda and Paul about the kind of animation they wanted. And it turns out that what they envisioned for animation for that would have been incredibly expensive. And so they just never sort of got around to the full-fledged film. Of course, those are different times. And now it might not be that expensive at all. So I don't know. Adrian knows more about making films than I do. So,
Yeah,
you know.
I mean, I believe, we had a conversation with Barry Chattington, who did Bruce McMouse, and he
Hmm.
said that there were storyboards for Rupert as early as kind of 74, 75. And when we spoke to Steve Holly, he mentioned the fact that I think it was Oscar Grillo, the animator. Paul actually engaged him to do some work on Rupert in the late 70s. It might have been 78, 79 time. And what they realized was that the complexity of what he did, um, or it was, the animations he did was so complex that it was impossible to do that on a large scale for a full feature film. So that never came about. Um, but by the sound of it, there are animations for Rupert that we've never seen before, done by different animators rather than was it Jeff Dunbar did the final animations on Rupert? Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Even more of a shame since he wrote a whole soundtrack for it. So,
yeah,
Right. And
um,
the soundtrack comes with a story. So, with his narrations in between, just to say what's going on and how the music fits that. So, yeah, it could be something he might sit back and do eventually. I mean, here's the thing about Rupert, unlike something else where you think, well, okay, maybe now at this point he's just lost interest in it. I mean, Rupert has run through from 1969 or 1968 even, through his entire career keeps on coming up. Like it's like the song Suicide, every couple of years a new version of Suicide gets recorded as a demo or, when he's just playing around and it's obviously on his mind and Rupert was like that too. I mean, he started off, I mean, this is in volume 1, I think, reading it to Heather McCartney when she was a little kid and Linda and Paul just got together. And that's when he began thinking about acquiring the rights and making a film. And he acquired the rights and he wrote music and he's got a story. So,
hmm.
uh, we're partway there.
Well, he's 82 now. So, you know, I hope he gets back to working on it and work on it really fast.
But like you say, he has so many of these things
Yeah.
that he starts. I mean, it should the phrase fertile imagination in the dictionary should just have a picture of him,
Yep.
because look at all the stuff, we wrote about the Thrillington sessions in volume 1.
Hmm.
And then in volume 2, finally, 6 years later, it comes out. And so there's got to be more activity about it. There's got to be a cover made. There's got to be sort of, raising awareness among the public that there's something coming that they should be interested in. And so, taking out those ads again, which I think he did. I think he did a short burst of it in around 71 when he started. on Thrillington, and then picked up again in '77 when it was going to come out, and we've used those ads as the sort of, inside papers of the book. When you open up the cover, they're all printed on both the front and back.
Hmm.
Adrian's idea, I believe.
It's only
Um,
because I spent so long finding those Thrillington ads, and I wanted to make sure there was a place to use them. And I thought that fans would get a real kick out of, opening the book. And for people who are well versed in Paul's life, the first thing they see is, you know, 50 ads for Thrillington that were placed back in 1977, and I got a real kick out of finding them in the newspapers in the British Library. So I thought that, why not put them on the inside of the book? It was just a bit of a wink to those hardened McCartney fans that are buying the book.
Or we could have put the porn film ads.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then one hand clapping is another example of this. We cover the whole period when he did it and how and why, and then it sat there for 50 years apart from bootlegs, and now suddenly it's out, sort of out. Um, yeah, I guess it counts as out. I mean, it's been on TV in Britain
Yeah.
now. So,
It
yeah.
does make you wonder actually what's coming our way over the next 5 years. Obviously Venus and Mars has its anniversary next year. Are we eventually going to get an official kind of cinematic release of Rockestra?
Hmm.
Maybe, in 4 years' time. Who knows?
And of course, there's the lack of what is it, London Town and Back to the Egg
Mhm.
and the
Yeah,
McCartney. I don't even remember what the McCartney collection. What is the name of the campaign? I
the
don't even remember
archive.
the
Yeah,
official name of it is. Although the Wings album's getting reissued in Japan on those mini the mini cardboard album cover
Hmm.
mini sleeves. The fact that London Town was not in the second batch of reissues tells me that it's being kept aside because something's bigger is coming for London Town, and maybe it'll be the box that we've been waiting for. Um, I wanted to ask you in a couple of things that I discovered that I found fascinating regarding Wings and um, the vibe happening within the band behind the scenes that the casual fan isn't going to pick up listening to the music is that first off, I know we've talked about this on this show with Alan in the past about that period in '74 in Nashville and about Jeff Britton fitting, not fitting, what was going wrong, what was going on in the dynamic in the group. I don't think till I read it in the book how dysfunctional Wings were in 1974, and it seemed to be with the arrival of Jimmy McCullough that, for lack of a better way of putting it, seemed like all hell started to break loose, especially when you put Jimmy and Denny in the same room. Tell us a little bit more about that and how that affected Jeff Britton, because Jeff didn't play by the same rules as Denny and Jimmy did.
yeah. I mean, Danny was sort of a fairly well-known. Um, well, let's just say he was the kind of man who liked the after parties. Um, when they were doing tours. So he'd be looking to pick up girls after concerts and sometimes, turning up late for the next day's concert because he was in somebody's bed. Even though him and Jojo had children together and eventually got married, they had a very open marriage. So, Danny was a bit of a party boy and, openly talked about using cocaine during that time in the British press. And we've been told by various people we interviewed that there were little white packages being passed in and out of the studio during sessions. And obviously they all enjoyed a drink and a smoke as well. So when you bring Jimmy into the fold as well, who takes that to the extreme, then yeah, it wasn't a particularly great combination. I can imagine that things weren't were very similar when Henry McCulloch was the guitarist. But you get the feeling that maybe Henry could hold his liquor a little bit more than Jimmy could.
Right.
Uh, so yeah, then you introduce into the fold a teetotaler in Jeff Brittain, who didn't drink, didn't smoke, doesn't even drink coffee or Coca-Cola. Um, you know, and he's the very extreme opposite of these two guys. And really, in Nashville, it all kind of started to unravel where, Jeff was playing designated driver while those guys were out partying. And, Jeff is the one who is kind of arguing for Paul to cut them some slack when they're driving cars into ditches
Right.
and getting thrown into jail cells. And ultimately, they're the ones who stab Jeff in the back and ultimately get him the sack because he didn't fit the kind
Mm.
of rock and roll mold that they wanted. They wanted somebody who would, who was a little more loose maybe. And,
Right. Yeah, that in a nutshell was what really was an eye opener. And I knew that there was the thing with Jeff with being a karate expert, not being a partier. The rock and roll lifestyle wasn't necessarily his his cup of tea, but the extent of what was going on, especially in Nashville, with the wrecked cars and the car accidents, and they're very fortunate there wasn't some serious things, God forbid, coming out of
yeah.
that period of time. And Paul actually starts sounding like he's the father. He's got to keep the kids in check, and on a daily basis, they're basically, pissing him off, for lack of a better way of putting it. And
Yeah, I
that the
mean,
band could have fallen apart at that time.
yeah, and it could have unraveled very differently for Jimmy, for example. I mean, he was arrested for reckless driving in Nashville, which could have led to a prison term. But ultimately, I think some money's probably exchanged hands, and Paul was very lucky that he knew some very influential people in Nashville, and Jimmy was let off the hook. But that still had implications on their visa application for the 1976 tour, and they had to engage a specialist American lawyer to get visas for the band. In fact, not just for the American tour, for when they were recording Venus and Mars as well in New Orleans. So yeah, it caused constant headaches for Paul, really, from that perspective. And it's very hard to understand why he cut Jimmy so much slack when he created so many problems, from very early on, like being arrested for reckless driving. That's not kind of a drunken brawl in a pub, or,
Right.
breaking your finger when you punch a television screen in a Paris hotel or something. That's pretty extreme behavior, is being arrested for reckless driving. Um,
Right.
it's interesting because we actually found a press conference Paul gave in Nashville the day he was leaving, the day before he was leaving, and I had to listen to it very carefully. But in the background, you could actually hear very close to the end of the conversation, one journalist said to Paul something like, I hear that one of your guys got into a bit of trouble last night. And Paul just kind of says, oh, we don't really want to talk about that, and just kind of brushes it away. But that was the only mention of what had happened with Jimmy during that entire press conference, which is mind blowing. I mean,
Right.
why was that not a major news story in Nashville the next day? A member of Paul McCartney's band is arrested. So they even managed to keep it out of the newspapers. It's incredible.
Wow. What I
And
found,
yet here we are, several pages later, in early '75. We're in New Orleans, and Jeff Brittain seems to be in the spotlight. Confidence maybe down. There's a mention of the meters coming into the picture, and you're with these musical heavyweights, and maybe Jeff's confidence wasn't there, and he ends up getting fired. Um, which is about where I think I've left off in the book at that point, was to like, wow, that really sucked for Jeff, the way it came to an end there. It wasn't just a rift with Jimmy, or he was wanting to get away from rock and roll to go back to karate. There was some tough stuff going on there behind the scenes.
Well, he was having trouble doing the drum part that Paul wanted for a particular song, and he'd been having trouble all through the week. And someone at one point suggested to him that he, might take a few tokes and loosen up a little bit. Maybe sort of like, get it out of his head that and he did, and that got him through that session. Um, but he didn't make a habit of it, and
Right.
later on, he was still having a problem. And it's kind of a funny thing because as much as Paul stood up for him in Nashville and after Nashville, um, you can see that, when it gets down to Paul's frustration in terms of what he wants on the record, uh, he didn't cut Jeff the slack that maybe, he could have. Paul might have been able to go in and do the drum thing that he wanted himself. I mean, who knows? He's a capable drummer. He could have gotten Jeff out of that particular scrape, perhaps.
Mhm.
He also wanted someone who'd be able to do these things live, and if he can't do them in the studio, that was a frustration for Paul. And I think Paul's frustration finally, caught up with him at that point. And he asked Tony Dorsey if he knew any other drummers, and
Right.
that's how we got to Joe.
It's interesting. One thing on that sort of Jeff's exit story, and one thing we could never prove, but it's one thing I still believe might have been a factor. Jimmy only arrived in New Orleans the day after Jeff was sacked, and there was a lot of talk that the two of them didn't get along. We have this kind of long-held theory that there was possibly an ultimatum handed to Paul, that it's either him or me, but it's something we've never been able to prove. And obviously we couldn't prove unless we spoke to, Denny Lane, who probably wouldn't have remembered anyway, or Jimmy himself, who's long dead. But it just seemed like such a coincidence that Jimmy didn't arrive on the scene in New Orleans until Jeff had gone. How, given that the two of them didn't get along. So yeah, I don't know. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll shed some more light on that.
You
Mhm.
talked about that press conference in Nashville. What I found really interesting about it is that they gave the impression that, well, they were sort of complimentary towards Jeff, but they kind of hinted this may not be a permanent band the way it is. So that in and of itself I found to be kind of fascinating. It was the first time they ever spoke that way about Wings.
Yeah, I mean, when they got back from Nashville, sorry, Paul spoke to the music press in Britain as well and said the same thing. The idea that Wings would be more of a loose arrangement. Maybe we'd use other musicians. More of the kind of tug of war, way of working. And then, a few weeks later, he decided to pull them into the studio and film One Hand Clapping. And I think the thing a lot of people don't realize about One Hand Clapping is that, that wasn't set up to be this great documentary and thing that's been on the silver screen recently and on
Hmm.
British television over Christmas period. Paul set that up as a way of documenting the band for his own pleasure, really. It was a vanity project. They had from day one, they weren't thinking of selling that to British television. And in fact they did try to sell it to British television and it was turned down in 1975, like mid 1975. Um, so yeah, but like I say, that one hand clapping then becomes almost like a second audition for a band that's falling apart. So it's interesting to watch that back with, a very different perspective, knowing that really what Paul was doing was, seeing whether or not what they'd rehearsed in Nashville was coming together, and whether or not Wings had a future. And one hand clapping proved to Paul that Wings did have a future. So, if you watch that documentary now, bearing that in mind, it gives it, a very different slant to, the portrait we've been given all these years, and even what Paul said himself on the introduction to One Hand Clapping when it was reissued this year.
Right.
Hmm.
There was another point, Ken, just to piggyback off of the dysfunction in 74 was that in the aftermath of Back to the Egg in 79, and perhaps it was fueled by the disappointing sales of Back to the Egg. Paul was a bit, um, how did I word it here in my notes? He was a bit uncertain about what Wings were and what they should be and what the future might hold. And coming out of Back to the Egg, if you can kind of maybe elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah. He apparently was not happy with Back to the Egg when it was finished. And he said it a couple of times. He didn't make a big point of saying it because the job was to promote the album, not to trash it. Um, but look at what he did. I mean, he signs a huge contract with Columbia in the United States and doesn't even bother coming here to help promote the album, which Columbia wasn't happy about. He sent Steve Holley and Lawrence Juber on the theory that, okay, these are the two new guys and everybody needs to get to know them, so let them do the press. Um, Also sent them to Europe to do the press. They say an awful lot of interviews about Back to the Egg, but Paul did a few radio things in Britain, and I think he did a radio show that was sort of syndicated in the US, but not a lot of promotion, not a lot of talking about it. And it turned out that it was because for whatever reasons that he hasn't really articulated, he didn't like it that much, or was disappointed in it. But with a lot of things that Paul does, uh, and doesn't like, wildlife is another. He'll say, yeah, but my son was playing the record the other day and I heard it, and it's not that bad.
Hmm.
Or someone else will say, yeah, but Wildlife is my favorite album, and he'll sort of reconsider how he feels about it. And it sounds strange, but you can kind of understand too, because when you're in the middle of it, making an album, um, you may have a love-hate relationship with the material. I mean, you might love it going in, and it might be so much work to get it finished that you're sick of it when you're done, or whatever. There's that other thing that when I interviewed him in 1990 and asked him why Flying to My Home was sort of stuck on the back of a single and not on Flowers in the Dirt itself, which had things like Louis Le Soleil, which, wasting
Stop knocking that song.
but and he said basically, listen, I write them all and I like them all, and it's hard for me to pick them. So I play them for my kids' friends and other people, and see what they like, you know. So it may sound odd that he changes his mind depending on what other people say about an album, but it's probably not that unnatural. He needs sometimes someone to say, you may not think this was very good, but the rest of us sort of like it. Maybe you can hear what we hear, and then he reconsiders. And I've been sort of hoping that he would take that to heart about Back to the Egg and put out the archival version eventually. But
But
I still don't.
Now that
he
there's a
continued doing that. I was just going to say, Ken, he continued doing that, and he probably still does that to this day, doesn't he? Playing his album for friends and family,
hmm,
because Chris Thomas said that he was sent an advance copy of McCartney 2, and he was sent the double LP.
hmm.
And he just said Paul sent him a note saying this was some music he'd been working on his own, and he wanted to know his thoughts. And he said to Chris, "Whatever you do, don't tell me it's a single album, because it's going to be a double album." And of course, when it does eventually come out, EMI talked him down to a single album and Columbia. So. So yeah, but he did, like you said, like Alan said, he does need that gratification, and I suppose we all do, really, don't we? We need people to tell us that what it is we're doing is good. And I think he just didn't really have much confidence in Back to the Egg for some reason when it was finished. I mean, he put it to every man and his dog. in 1979 before it came out. You know, he played tracks to George Harrison, Pete Townsend, David Bowie. I think ABBA dropped by the studio, didn't they? I mean, it was just like a who's who of the pop industry at that time, and they all heard cuts from that album. So he was obviously desperate to gauge people's opinions of what they thought, and sometimes. They reacted in the way that he hoped they would, and sometimes they didn't. You know, there's a story in the book where I think it's David Bowie comes to the studio and Paul starts playing cuts from Back to the Egg. And then all of a sudden he slips in one that he's been working on that's not going to be on Back to the Egg. And Bowie goes, "Oh, I don't like that one." And I think Chris Thomas said that by the end of the Bowie kind of listening party, you might want to call it now, they were back to the original running order for Back to the Egg. But Paul's confidence was wobbling, and he was thinking about putting other things in there that he was working on at that time that went on and ended up in things like Broad Street, or they were going to be penciled for Cold Cuts, which never happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, you know, his confidence in that album was bizarrely low, you know, given the quality of the vast majority of the stuff on that album. Yeah, as Alan said this a number of times in interviews, that I think when that's eventually reissued on its 50th anniversary, it will have its day and it will be regarded as one of the great Wings albums. But he's never given it the opportunity for that to happen so far.
Yeah. Well, he's very affected by public opinion and, with the reappraisal of Ram, especially, I'm sure now he's very proud of Ram, you know. I do think that if indeed we do get an archival box set of London Town and Back to the Egg, and there's some new respect given to both those albums, maybe that will in some way influence how he feels about it. But
I want to add something. There's one other side to this business of playing it for everybody to get their opinion, see what they
yeah,
like, which is that it sometimes also brings out his inner contrarian streak. There's another story we have from Chris Thomas about Pete Townsend coming to the studio and playing, I think it was Arrow Through Me, and
hmm.
said, "Yeah, this is the great thing about this is there's no bass on it." And pretty much as soon as Townsend left, Paul added a bass. So,
That's funny. One of the things that struck me as being surprising here was when Paul went to Nashville and they stayed at Curly Putnam's house and they had an assistant there that did groceries and stuff. Linda asked for bacon to be sent to the house, saying that Paul loves his bacon. And they had a meal where, ironically, they had country ham, since that's the name of the band that recorded Walking in the Park with Eloise. With all this talk about Paul being a vegetarian, and even during the Wings Over America tour, for the other members of the group, they did allow meat, correct, to be eaten. You know, Paul has taken the stance of, being such a strict vegetarian all these years. I'm surprised that in 1974 they were still eating meat.
yeah, that surprised us too a bit because the famous gambling lamb story takes place in volume 1.
Hmm.
And they began talking about vegetarianism in volume 1. But if you look at the interviews they give about it, it's sort of I'm not saying absolutely everything has to be. I'm not saying vegan. I'm not saying, so he's evolved,
Hmm.
pretty steadily. And now he looks back and it sort of seems as if, he's been vegetarian since 1971, but it was much more gradual than that. And that's why we included those things, I think, because I mean, they were in interviews and they were, published and it sort of does document how his vegetarianism developed and how, at first it wasn't very strict. I mean, one of the things I think Denny Seiwell told us, and other people have mentioned it too, is that Linda made an incredible Thanksgiving turkey, you know? So it was a while before, but also I think, there are some later ones that you'll come to in this volume where we see, I think, when Linda actually decides that she just wants to be vegetarian, doesn't want to eat meat of any kind. That's a bit after Nashville. It might even be really after Wings Over America. So, it became stricter over time. It didn't, sprout full blown in 1971. We're sort of showing how it happened. And it seemed like, we didn't want to whitewash, just because vegetarianism is part of his overall message now, really.
Right.
We didn't want to whitewash it when we came up to, Linda saying my husband likes to have his bacon. She said it, and we're talking about, them setting up at Curly Putman's house and what she needed and what she asked for and all that. So we felt that we should give it as it happened.
Hmm. One of the things I really appreciate about what I'm reading is just how much care and time Paul took into these recordings. There are certain songs that he just kept trying over and over and over again, overdubbing, still not being happy. It really gives you an appreciation of how much he cared. And he had ideas in his head that just weren't fully realized yet. But he kept on working at it time and time again. He didn't just bang these songs out. And what I'd like to get from the two of you is your understanding of this was a very productive time for Paul, a very active time for Paul. There was hardly any time when he wasn't working. And when he took vacations, he really needed them because he did so much work. But I always like to bring up the fact that Paul really wanted Wings to be established as a band to the point where Wings at the Speed of Sound has all five members singing lead. That really proves the point. He wanted to have Denny sing lead on songs, even if Denny didn't write them. And you even say in your book that Paul was encouraging Denny to write from 1972 on for Wings. And yet he has to deal with the frustration of Wings members leaving all the time. He has to keep picking up the pieces. And while he's proud of all the success that he's having with Wings, at times it must get really it must really frustrate him to hold a band together when he's trying to do everything he can so that the other members get noticed, and yet he can't hold on to a band, the same members, for a few years. Even Denny Lane said in that middle period, I think maybe the Nashville period, but he really wants to quit. He doesn't want to work with Paul. Um, what was the whole you've got this struggle to keep Wings together. He's also proud of all the success that he's having. How does he deal with this on a regular basis? I kind of get the feeling that by the time Jimmy and Joe left, maybe the air was let out of the bag. Maybe Paul didn't care as much as I love Back to the Egg, and what he was doing then. But to try to keep a band together, to try to keep staying on top, you know, how do you think he dealt with that whole period? Because he was successful with Wings, you know, the records really sold very well. In America, he had five number one albums in a row, you know. How do you think Paul really handled this whole period? And was it more something to be proud of because of the success, or more frustrated because of the fact that Wings could never stay the same lineup of musicians all the time? And dealing with, as we said, uh, drug problems, staying up late, partying, all that, when Paul and Linda did their share, but they were in control of themselves all the time. They were like the parents, especially in this middle band. Um, how do you respond to all that, looking at this whole period?
Um, Here's the thing. Paul is a really complex guy. There are no sort of easy, yes, this is what he feels and this is what he wants. There are layers going on, and things are weighted differently one day than they are the next day. I mean, he wanted a band. He really wanted a band. And he, as you say, he encouraged the others to sing. He encouraged Denny to write. He encouraged the others to write. I mean, when he put Lawrence Juber and Steve Holley under contract, there was a provision in the contract for if they wrote any songs, MPL would be the publisher. Um, so he is assuming that they might write songs, right? I mean,
Hmm.
um, the thing is that he also has to have realized by this point in the band, by the Mark 3 or 4, whatever, however you count it, that it's not really going to be a band the way other bands are bands, the way the Rolling Stones are a band, or the way the Beatles were a band, because you have the front guy who was a Beatle, and no one else in that band is ever going to have been a Beatle, you know? And not just a Beatle as such as the label, but a Beatle who wrote some of the most revered music of the 60s, who was considered, such an incredible bassist. And like he is on a level that no matter who he gets, are really not going to be his equals musically. Well, I mean, he could have, as he put it in an interview that we quoted in Volume 1, he could have gone the superstar route, and then they
Hmm.
would have all been equals. But he didn't want that, and that actually probably would have been disastrous because with that level of accomplishment also comes a reasonably high level of ego most of the time, and you get clashes that would have sort of probably destroyed it pretty quickly. Look at Blind Faith. Blind Faith was you couldn't have asked for a super group, and they lasted one album and a tour, and that was it. And so, and I think he saw that actually, and that would have weighed into his decision too. But he wanted a band, but he understood that he also is the boss. And he made it clear to all the others too, these are the arrangements I want. These are the guitar solos I want. It's very hard to have a real band if you're telling the lead guitarist what the solo is. That's just the way it is. I really think he did want Wings to be a success as a band and seen as a band, but here we are still debating whether they're a band, and it's like 50 years later. So,
Hmm.
I think from the perspective of the members of Wings as well, that there were similar frustrations. We were told that, Jimmy, for example, felt that Wings would open doors for him and that he could become a star in his own right. He could, walk out of Paul's shadow and front a group and release hit records. And, he tried to do that with White Line and it just didn't come off. The single didn't even chart with White Line. And the record label didn't even option a second single with White Line because the first single performed so badly. So, you get the feeling that, from the perspective of the members of the group, Paul's probably telling them all the time, you can write songs and you'll have a song on the next album. And they're really thinking that, this next album is going to be the big break for them. I'm sure Denny Lane had a similar thoughts as well. But it really didn't pay off for them. And from Jimmy's perspective, it kind of all erupted in Paul's farmhouse in a machine gun haze of ketchup and eggs, when he departed the band. For Joe English, it was, he was homesick and decided that, he just, he wanted to go back to America. And for Denny, it just took an awful lot longer. It took until, what was it, April 1981 when he left Wings. But I'm sure that Denny had, similar frustrations that he was constantly in the shadow of somebody who'd been a Beatle. And, even though Denny Lane had been in the Moody Blues, weren't on the same level when it came to, creating the cultural shift that the Beatles created in the 1970s, on every single level. It wasn't just the music that the Beatles influence, it was art, it was fashion, it was everything that was going on in the world. And
Right.
nobody could live on that same level as Paul. And I think that had to be something that every member of that group lived with. And in some cases, I think this probably applies to the final lineup of Wings more so than any other. Some cases the band members were willing to accept that. In some cases they weren't. You get the feeling that, and we've spoken to and in some cases met quite a lot of these people that perhaps because of the circumstances in which they came into the band, Steve and Lawrence were, I don't know, perhaps the most humble when it came to accepting, their part within the group because they hadn't been sold a different vision. When Denny Sywell, for example, joined Wings in 1971, he was told we'll all be equals. But you get the feeling that by 1978, when Paul brought two new band members in, that they weren't having those similar conversations. They were engaged on contracts and things were done very differently. So yeah, there was certainly this evolution of the concept of Wings being a band. Um, and yeah, like Alan said, well, we could debate this till the cows come home, and
Mhm.
fans will be debating this still in 100 years' time.
And I lead those debates all the time.
I mean, I
But
feel like Denny had ample opportunity to make significant contributions. As you said, Paul left the door wide open. He encouraged. And Denny had ample opportunity to make numerous contributions to every album and maybe even do a solo album that was more of a Denny record than the Holidays album.
Mm.
And he just did not grab that opportunity.
Well, you'd regularly see, interviews with Denny throughout the 70s, and he was very honest about it. He'd just say things like, "Well, I'm more lazy than Paul," or he'd say things like, "For me, when I'm
Yeah.
songwriting, I have to be in a particular mood, and I have to be on holiday, or I have to be this or that to songwrite." And he just was nowhere near as prolific as Paul. Paul could be on tour and feeling depressed, and the next thing, he's writing, "Don't let it bring you down." It's kind of for Paul, every waking moment was an opportunity to compose music, and that just simply wasn't the case with Denny Lane. He was never a prolific songwriter. We've actually seen, we were handed by a collector, an inventory of songs that Denny wrote during his time with Wings. I don't think it totaled more than 20 or 30 songs. So, I mean, compared to what Paul was producing during that period, that's just nothing really. That's maybe one or two songs per album.
well,
But yeah,
just sorry,
sorry, go on, Ken.
I was going to say, just on a creative level, I think I don't think it's accurate to say that like the other members were just doing whatever Paul dictated to them because certainly in my conversations with Denny Sywell and Lawrence Juber, they'll tell me if they had a good idea that they wanted to bring to a song and they played it for Paul and he liked it, he would accept it. He would have the final say, but it's not like everything that you heard on those songs were were all from his own mind.
Yeah, but I think that's what it boils down to, though, doesn't it? Really, is that Paul wasn't just the front man; he was also the producer of most of those records. So he had the final say.
Hmm.
So if, for example, you saw in the first book in the Give Ireland Back to the Irish session, uh, you know, Henry McCulloch labors through 20 different attempts to do the guitar solo. At
Hmm.
the beginning of Give Ireland Back to the Irish, it was documented by a journalist who was there at the time. And in the end, they settle on half a dozen notes or something to start the song off. So, those were Henry's ideas, but Paul was ultimately the one producing the album. So he was the one who had the final say in how that record sounded. But no, I think you're absolutely right, Ken. That there was always, every guitar part and drum part, everything on those records was open for debate. But ultimately, what came out the other end, and I think it's something Joe English says, isn't it, in our book, is, 9 times out of 10, what comes out the other end is Paul McCartney. So, uh, you know,
Hmm. Could you go into the contracts? Because I was reading right around the time, I think, of Venus and Mars. They were offered contracts in which they would be paid for their live performances at a percentage of the records instead of just, a salary kind of position. And Denny Lane was against it because he felt he should be paid more than the other two musicians. And so what exactly happened and how were they paid during this middle period?
It's kind of complicated. I mean, we do get into what they were paid without really getting into the weeds of the contracts. But um, for the Australian, European, and Wings Over America tour, they were paid something like, what was it, a $100,000 or $200,000 sort of overall bonus? Was that? I can't remember what the number
Yeah,
was.
they were paid basically per album and and per tour, rather than originally in Nashville. There was a conversation, and they were presented with contracts that had been drafted by their manager or Paul's manager, Brian Brolly. And the idea was that they would be paid percentage points on records and a percentage of box office takings, which at that time was unprecedented. That was really what Denny Sywell and Henry McCulloch and they were hoping for from day one, really. That was the golden ticket, the golden goose. That was the big payday, was to get those percentage points. Because that didn't just mean that you took away a check that day, it meant you were taking checks home for the rest of your life. But what ended up happening in Nashville was that their behavior was so raucous, and well, it was beyond raucous, wasn't it? It was they were breaking American laws and getting thrown in jails and things. So that those contracts were torn up. So when they came back to England after the Nashville debacle,
Hmm.
everything changed, and they were presented with this kind of super session fee deal instead, which was basically like a glorified or upscaled version of the hippie handshake contract that they first iteration of Wing signed in 71. But in this case, I think they were paid pretty well for the sessions. I think Jeff told us it was something like £300 a session, which is a lot of money. But again, equates to nothing compared to what they would have received had they signed contracts for Venus and Mars, and for an album that went platinum in America and probably the same in England. They would have made phenomenal amounts of money. And imagine them all taking home a small percentage of the box office of Wings Over America, which grossed, well, I can't remember the figure. We're talking $3-4 million in America in 1976. Those were huge sums of money. Um, but yeah, the contract situation really evolved throughout the 70s, and eventually they did sign contracts and effectively became like employees of NPL, whereby they'd be paid, a certain fee for every album and every tour that they did.
And that was one of Denny's objections. He didn't want to feel like he was an employee of Paul. He wanted to feel like he was in a band with Paul. So that was part of his reasoning for arguing against contracts when they came up.
It's
Um,
fascinating, though, to this conversation, knowing what we read in Volume 1 about how the financial state of the band really was one of the undoings of the Henry McCullough, Denny Sywell lineup. How Denny was, broke, Denny Sywell, that is, and then here we're having a completely different discussion just a year or two later about the finances within Wings.
Yeah, I mean, you get the feeling that, what happened with Denny and Henry, really kind of got under Paul's skin, and he really wanted to right that wrong in 74. And when everything unraveled in Nashville, it must have been really frustrating, not to be able to see that through, really.
Right.
But I mean, if he had presented them with those contracts after what happened in Nashville, it'd be like telling a schoolboy that he can misbehave every day and there's going to be no repercussions.
Right.
So ultimately, those contracts were torn up.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Well,
Can you talk a little bit about this competition apparently between the Beatles? Because there are certain moments here where you mentioned that Paul knew that John was about to release Whatever Gets You Through the Night as a single, and Paul wanted to release Junior's Farm the same week or something. And also, uh, when Paul was in Nashville, um, he didn't want to use Pete Drake to do slide guitar work because George and Ringo used him, so they got Lloyd Green instead. You know, how do, is it always in the back of Paul's mind what the other Beatles are doing?
Seems to have been. I mean, even early on in Volume 1, he didn't want to be produced by Spector. He didn't want to have Jim Keltner drumming because the others were doing that. He wanted to maintain his uniqueness within the Beatles community, let's say, you know. So anything that the others were doing, he didn't want to do. And he did keep track of who was releasing what. And it's kind of funny because, you know, we always read about how the Beatles and the Stones used to coordinate their releases so they wouldn't be competing directly against each other. They'd know when each had, you know, a single to put out, and they'd stagger them a little bit. That unraveled within the Beatles really very quickly when we had the dispute over Let It Be and and the McCartney album, you know.
Hmm.
Um, and you would think, okay, you know, we're talking about albums. We're not talking about they're putting out a Mercedes, you know, so people can afford two albums. It's, you know, it just was crazy. But yeah, he kept tabs on what John was putting out, what George was putting out. I don't think he particularly would have been that competitive with Ringo because, you know, if Ringo wanted a song, he'd write him a song. There's a couple of examples of that already, you know, in each volume. Um, so yeah, there was a competition. It wasn't like a killer competition, but you know, he wanted to, of the former Beatles, sort of be the one that was having the most hits. Not unusual, really. Do you think?
Mm. And
No.
to think that there was a span of time when he, on for lack of a better way of putting it, he met his match with Ringo, who had that run of singles from
Mhm.
71 to 74 that basically came very close to matching a big run that Wings had.
Yeah.
Sure that Paul didn't expect competition to come from that direction.
Yeah, it's funny though, the writing about, you know, the releases. If there were ones where he was head to head with Ringo, I don't really remember them. I remember instances of George having something out around the same time he did, and John having something out around the same time he did, and trying to sort of, you know, figure out how that was going to work, you know. Um, I don't remember Ringo coming up much at all. Do you remember, Adrian?
I'm just thinking that there were even examples where Paul would put out a trade ad for his single, and it'd say, you know, with a date or coming soon. And then you wouldn't see the single arrive in Britain, for example, for 2 or 3 weeks after that, which was unheard of. You know, the trade ads always corresponded with a single arriving in the shops. And when we looked into that, that's the reasoning we found was because basically he didn't want to be in direct competition with George. I think it was possibly, you know, a gentleman's agreement between them. You know, is it good for both of us to have a single out on the very same week? Wouldn't we prefer it if we staggered them? Then we can both be number one and we're not vying for number one. But I think there are a few examples where they've all got a single in the chart at exactly the same time.
Yeah.
Was it in late 74? They were all in the charts at the same time. It's in
Mhm.
the book, and it's really interesting, you know, documenting. You know, we always try and mention in the book whenever one of the Beatles has got a new product out, because it's interesting to see what the other Beatles are up to and how Paul responds to it. So yeah, we did try and put as much of that in the book as we possibly could.
Yeah. There was a time there when all four of them were in the top 40 in Billboard in America. And you even said that maybe it was a blow to Paul's ego that George toured America before Paul did.
Mm. Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah. And when Paul was asked about George's tour, he was very guarded in his responses, wasn't he? Quite often he'd say that George's tour was really good. But then when he was caught in a more candid moment, maybe a year or so later, he'd make more critical comments about what George was doing on tour. And you can't help but think that he must have been processing all of that himself. He's gearing up to tour America in '76, and he sees the criticism of George's tour in late '74. He must have been making notes to say, well, okay, so support act didn't go down well, didn't play enough hits. These are all things that were said by the press.
Yeah.
So you can't help but think that all that time when Paul's making his notes for the perfect tour, that he's, looking at the mistakes that the people have made and the victories that the people are having. We also document Paul going out to watch other groups. So he goes to watch Led Zeppelin and
Mm.
effectively just takes their entire stage setup and copies it, down to having an acoustic set, which is what Zeppelin did on tour in
Uh-huh.
'74. So, um, so you can, and he sees Bowie on tour when he's in Nashville, and Bowie's playing with a horn section. He'd seen the Rolling Stones playing with a horn section, so he's all the time making notes about things that work and things that don't work on tour. And George was definitely on that list for sure, and that's got to be one of the reasons maybe why he softened his stance on playing Beatles songs with Wings in '75, '76, because George was criticized for not playing enough of the hits. And obviously by that time, Paul had had quite a lot of hits in his own right as a solo artist, but nothing really compared to him going out and touring playing Yesterday. I mean, so yeah, but yeah, like I say, it was an interesting evolution over that period of seeing how Paul put that tour together in '76.
Yeah. Well, you actually say that it was Denny Lane that convinced Paul to play some Beatles.
But
Just
they'd been re
don't dismiss that period.
but they'd been rehearsing numbers before that. I think it was really Denny that kind of pushed him over the edge to make the decision. Because they rehearsed other numbers that they didn't tour. I think they played the Long and Winding Road in rehearsals, and that wasn't toured. I think there were some others, or was it? Or was
Wings
it?
Over America it was.
Or was it? Sorry, was it? Let It Be. There was definitely one of Paul's ballads that he
Right.
rehearsed that they didn't take on tour. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so, but yeah, that obviously there were other influences like Denny Lane in there as well.
Hmm. Okay. Can't hear you, Darren.
I apologize. I had my mic off. I don't know if it's in the book or not, but just popped into my head. Why were they performing Simon and Garfunkel's Richard Cory? Other than maybe they just liked the song.
I think that was something really for Denny, right? I mean, he at least starts it, and maybe it was his choice. You know,
Okay.
got to sing an acoustic song. What do you want it to be? Um,
Yeah,
it is an
not a
un
great, not a great commercial choice either, really, was it? Putting someone else's song on the wing, on a tour that you're eventually going to release as an album. So
And why did Paul choose to perform Soily at the end of the Wings Over America tour? I know he did it in previous tours, but to make that your encore, a song that he hadn't even released, most people wouldn't even know at all. Why would he even choose to do that?
that was possibly the magic of it. Really, was that it was unexpected. It was something people hadn't heard. So it came as a surprise when they played it as an encore. That's all I could speculate really on that front.
Hmm.
Because these days, Paul just comes back on and plays more hits, doesn't he? Really?
Oh yeah.
and it was a
He might
bother.
now he might start playing Soiling when if he tours in 2025 at the end of his show. It's funny because that's a great point, Ken, and um, it never occurred to me before that this was really an obscure song. Uh, I still remember hearing when I was a kid, and it made total sense. It was a concert number, It was meant for the stage. It was a rocker at the end of a rock show, and it made complete sense. But wait a minute. No, it's unusual now looking back through the years and the hundreds of shows I've been to. Can't think of too many artists doing, you know, something obscure to wrap up the show. I think Pink Floyd even caught a little heat when they staged The Wall in 80 and 81, that it just ended with outside the wall and the show was over. No encore, no, no hit, no money or anything at the end. Um, I wanted to bring up two albums that get covered in your book that aren't Wings albums, but they are, in a way. McGear, which is kind of the first thing that the first project we're introduced to in the new book in Vol.2. The McGear album, which was sort of a Wings record. Uh, you know, I, unlike Ken, who will read a book like a normal person from beginning to end, I tend to go jump into the middle of books and go look up juicy parts and bits of info, almost like I'm researching. And I have not read the section, which is the beginning on McGear. Let's talk about the McGear album and the genesis of that project um, in '74, coming out of
Well,
Band
I
on
th
the.
well, I think the biggest surprise we found out about that album was that originally Paul wanted to engage Tony Visconti to produce it. So the idea was going to be that it would be the McCartney brothers just writing and recording songs together, and they'd have an independent producer. And you'll read in the book how that didn't come about. Paul kind of fell out with Tony Visconti.
Did it have
Um,
anything to do with lack of credit on Band on the Run?
Perhaps, yeah. That was one of the things, but I won't give too much away because some people listening might not have read the book. But that was fascinating to discover that they were going to engage a producer for that album. But really, the genesis of that album began in '73 when they recorded a couple of singles together. Um, and I think they liked working together, and they'd had a conversation that once Paul got back from Lagos, working on Band on the Run, that they would do something together. And it just so happened that when Paul returned from Lagos, he was down a drummer and a guitarist. So for him, it was really ideal timing to audition musicians. So he brought in you know two musicians, one of whom ended up joining Wings and one of whom didn't. Again, I won't give too much away for people who maybe haven't read the book. Um, but yeah, we felt it was important to document McGear because Alan always described it as being a stealth Wings album,
Mhm.
and I
Yeah.
think that's really accurate. And we had a really interesting conversation with the recording engineer Pete Tattersall, who worked at Strawberry Studios, and with Mike McCartney himself, kind of talking through those sessions. And there were a lot of really interesting things going on in kind of Paul's private life, in Mike's life as well. His kind of relationship with some of the members of Grimm's was deteriorating, and that's why he kind of ended up in the studio with Paul. And we felt that you know, as easy as it would have been to kind of jump through that period of Paul's recording career, we felt that McGear, really deserved as much attention as everything else we've been writing about. So yeah, we dedicate a whole chapter to it in this new
Mm.
book.
And then the Holidays album from Denny Lane, which was practically a Wings album, sort of.
Well, it was sort of a Paul and Denny duo in the sense that Paul played all the instruments. I think Denny then overdubbed a couple of guitar lines and then the vocals. But so it was really just the two of them. That had a different purpose in a way. I mean, by now Paul is Buddy Holly's publisher,
Right.
and he's about to introduce Buddy Holly Week. And as he envisioned it, Denny's album was going to be one of the centerpieces of Buddy Holly Week. It didn't work out that way because it wasn't really out in time. I think a single was out just.
Mhm.
Um, But there it was a combination of giving Denny something to do that, would please him because he was also a Buddy Holly fan, um, making it about as easy as it could be for Denny to do it by basically recording all the instruments, and Denny really just had to come in and sing it. I bet the guitar lines he added were pretty optional. Um, and it was going to sort of point up Paul's other side, which is the publisher
Mhm.
side. And that's another element that runs through this book. It starts obviously in volume one, excuse me, in volume one when he gets the Buddy Holly catalog. Um, but throughout this volume, he's gaining more and more catalogs of really interesting and important stuff. I mean, a huge number of standards that came into his ownership, a huge number of Broadway musicals that came into his ownership. I mean, Annie, Grease, not just little musicals, but things that were
Mhm.
going to earn a huge amount of money. But of all that stuff, as much as he loves standards and likes musicals and all that, I mean, Buddy Holly was his guy. And so holidays, sort of served a lot of purposes you know, in a vanity sense. I don't really mean it in the sort of with the negative connotations that vanity projects, are thought of as these days. But he wanted to do a Buddy Holly album. He wanted something for Denny to do, and uh, and there it was. Very different from the from the McGear project,
Mhm.
Um, and with McGear, the interesting thing and why I always call it a Stealth Wings album is because Paul wrote most of the stuff with Mike. So this is also an album of McCartney compositions that nobody really thinks about as McCartney compositions. They're collaborations, of course, but still they're part of his catalog. They're part of his creative catalog. And the whole point of the McCartney Legacy series and the name of the series is that we want to cover all of his creative
Right.
and that'll later on include his artworks and his classical stuff and his kids' books and you name it.
It's interesting actually on social media and in some of the interviews Alan and I have done since the book came out. There's been a lot of talk about McGear and people posting pictures of their copy of the record. And I've revisited this for the first time in 50 years. So that's really nice to see that people are checking out that album, and a lot of people checking it out for the very first time. We
Mhm.
spoke to a journalist in America recently who had never heard of McGear. I said that's possibly because when the album was released in America, I don't think it even charted on the Billboard charts. So DJs here wouldn't have heard of the album. Alan and I have always said that perhaps if they'd released that album under the moniker the McCartney Brothers, then maybe it would have sold in millions, rather than having such a limited chart success that it did have. But
Right.
yeah, it's really interesting to see people streaming and pulling out their vinyl copies of McGear after 50 years because they've read that chapter of the book, which is really what this project's all about. One of your very famous guests said to you, didn't he, Peter Jackson, that our first volume made him revisit albums that he hadn't listened to in 50 years.
Right.
And that's really gratifying for Alan and I that, when we've explored these albums over this 10-year period in so much detail that people are now getting to, utilize the research that we've done, and it's enriching their listening experience as much as it's enriched ours during the time that we've been working on it. Because, there are songs from this period that I appreciate so much more now that I've written these two volumes than I did, as just I wouldn't say a casual McCartney fan, but like a normal McCartney fan before. So yeah, that's really great to see on social media.
Can you come up with a song or two, Adrian, that you weren't familiar with before you started the project?
I don't know. I wouldn't say the songs that I wasn't familiar with, but there are songs that certainly have moved up my list of, into my McCartney top 10 since we did this project. Yeah. Some People Never Know from Wildlife, I think is now among my favorite McCartney songs of all time. And Little Lamb Dragonfly as well. That's in my top 10.
That's yeah.
There are a few others that have crept up there, and yeah, I've got to say my appreciation of Back to the Egg, you know,
Right.
was raised significantly by working on this project.
And one thing
Nice.
about the McGear album that's brought up here is that Paul's contract with EMI was almost up, and Lee Eastman was kind of using Paul as leverage with Warner Brothers. So if you take Mike McCartney, maybe you'll get Paul on your record label.
Yeah, and I mean, we saw the paperwork from, the Warner archive about, kind of correspondence between people like Ron Cass and Mo Austin was it at Warner, who were talking about things like the bigger picture, which was
Hmm.
obviously trying to snare Paul. It was, and that's no discredit to Mike, as a recording artist, but in terms of sales, there's really no comparison between Mike and Paul. So from a record company executive's perspective, snaring Paul was the big picture. Uh, so yeah, there was certainly a lot of that going on in the background throughout that period, and then that continued on into when Paul signed with Columbia in 1979.
Hmm. One thing you really clear up, and I'm grateful that you did, is what exactly is Paul saying at the very beginning of Listen to What the Man Said? Because this had something to do with Dr. John and the guitarist from the Meters, Leo Nocentelli, who were used for backing vocals. And so you say here, Paul acknowledged, he said, I put that on the beginning of the vocal track down in New Orleans. Leo No Cantelli, as the faces called him, he talks like that. All right, okay,
All
okay.
right, okay.
Dr.
Very
John
good to see you again.
talks like that too, sort of, very New Orleans voice. So that was
Hmm.
me doing a little impression. I always thought he was saying Harry like Harry Nilsson, you know, but now we know.
Well, they
Evidently,
call
Saying the
Harry
word
was a
Harry.
nickname.
Yeah, they call it cultural appropriation these days, wouldn't they? You'd never get away with that.
Can you there's one other thing I wanted to bring up is, what we've heard for so many years about John Lennon considering going to New Orleans and working on the Venus and Mars album, which you talk about here. And you do say that Paul was really disappointed that John didn't show up. The engineers were kind of relieved in a way. Maybe because it would have been reminiscing too much, or it would have taken up too much studio time, or what?
I think
Or
they I think they were just afraid that he would distract Paul from the mission being to record this album. I mean,
Hmm.
keeping in mind that he turned up with an album that was completely planned start to finish. Obviously, things were going to happen in the sessions that, maybe weren't envisioned and he would keep and like happens in any session. But, he had made that scroll when he was in Jamaica where he wrote out all the lyrics and then taped the pages together and rolled it up as a scroll. That was the album in order, pretty much. And
Right.
so everyone was expecting him to sort of, using that as a blueprint to make this album in New Orleans. John coming down to New Orleans didn't necessarily mean John was going to help with Venus and Mars. It could have meant they were going to stop and do something else. In fact, it almost certainly would have meant that because you can't see John saying, "Oh yeah, I'll just do some backing vocals on
Hmm.
what the man said." So, I think they were afraid that it would sort of create chaos, and keeping in mind that also John at that point was sort of known for creating chaos anyway, wherever he was, or at least that was the the vision of John that was presented in the media, because he would get into the papers when he created chaos, getting thrown.
Just think, just think of the mayhem that John Lennon and Jimmy McCullough could have
Oh man,
cooked up with, cooked up.
God, it doesn't even bear thinking. But yeah,
Hmm.
and then, take it to its logical extreme. John could have sort of, lifted Jimmy out of Wings and taken him
Yeah.
to do, some other projects of his own. So,
Oh, Paul would have loved that.
not at that point, I don't think he wouldn't have, but later on, yeah.
I just want to mention one thing that when I read about this, I smiled because Adrian, you don't know this about Alan, but he is a massive, massive Andrew Lloyd Webber fan.
This is
And it
true.
says here that Paul's manager, Brian Brawley, had a hand in launching Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice's musical Jesus Christ Superstar and getting MCA to take the soundtrack. And Brawley knew that Alan O'Duffy engineered the recordings, and Brawley suggested O'Duffy to engineer Junior's Farm. So, part of the reason why Junior's Farm is such a great sounding record is because Alan O'Duffy, who worked on Jesus Christ Superstar, one of Alan's favorite musicals, um, you know, he
Yeah,
shared
I mean,
about Alan, his
I, I,
feelings
I
about
think
Andrew Lloyd Webber.
I think we can say that, a sign of the restraint that I brought to this project was that there wasn't a footnote talking all about
Alan's three-page footnote about
it's
the
interesting.
horse.
I actually insisted that we included that stuff because
Good, good.
I knew about Alan's complete disdain for Andrew Lloyd Webber. And I'm sure if you were to trace our WhatsApp conversations for references to ALW and, things like that, there'd be a lot of disdain from Alan about why do we need to include this.
yeah, because I would have thought it would embarrass O'Duffy,
Yeah.
involved
Not
with
at
it.
all.
All right, so as we wind down this first part of our McCartney Legacy discussion, because remember, folks, the second half is going to be our first show of 2025. More from Adrian and Alan. You could win a copy of this book, and it'll have a cover, the one that you can win. This one, I got a cover. I just took it off, so it stayed nice. Um, but we do have copies of the McCartney Legacy Vol.2. The blue, it would look like that, the one you would win. We have three copies that we'd like to make available of Vol.2, Allan and Adrian's book, in much the same way as we did a few weeks back when we gave away copies of the Beatles US albums, 1964 US albums vinyl box set. So we've got three copies of the book, so three folks are going to be picked at random. All you need to do is send us an email, and we have these kind of regulations. First off, please, this is only open to residents of the United States. We apologize to those of you in Canada and in England and Japan, etc., and other parts of Europe, but this is only open to U.S. residents. What was the other point? Also, one email per entry, please. One email per person, um, because you may very well be disqualified if you send us numerous email entries. And please, in the subject line, McCartney contest in the subject line, please, U.S. residents only, and one entry per person. Email us at.
Things we said today radio show at gmail.com.
So email us there. One entry per person, one email per person. In the subject line, McCartney contest. Okay, and we'll be giving three of these books for the next couple of weeks because we're going to
Yeah,
be
question.
here with another show. Oh, we have the trivia question too. Yes, and Ken came up with this one. I did the Beatle one a couple of weeks back. So, Ken, the question, we want you to answer this question to be eligible.
Well, I thought I'd make this one of my easier trivia questions. So, based on the Billboard charts in America, Paul McCartney in his solo career had two live recordings that made the top 10 on Billboard's Hot 100. And in fact, one of those two songs went to number one. Name both those songs. They're live recordings. They both made the top 10. One of them hit number one. Okay? And the deadline for this contest.
You have a full month to enter. Send us your emails. Cutoff point January 27th and answer the trivia question: which two McCartney singles were hit songs that were recorded live? Which two live singles were big hits? One of them was a number one, the other top 10. And let us know the two songs with your email. And we'll pick three at random after the 27th of January and give you a copy of a book that will have a cover. Now, while Adrian is sitting here thinking, I committed a second show with these nuts, Adrian is back. We have a handshake agreement on that for our next show, which will be our first of 2025. The McCartney Legacy Vol.2, Show 2, on the way. So, folks, join us then.
Thank you, Adrian, for joining us.
Thank you, Adrian, and there's more madness for you ahead.
Looking forward to it.
And that was tremendous. It's always great to have Adrian back on the show, especially Adrian with Allan talking about the McCartney Legacy books. And we can't wait to rejoin them next week on Things We Said Today.
It has to be strange, Allan, from having worked on these books so hard and for so long, and now here you're sitting talking about them as finished,
Yeah, that's nice, I have to say.
Are you thinking about three yet?
Thinking about it? Yes, absolutely, of course. Of course.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. All right. So before we say our goodbyes, let's tell the folks what we've been up to. Darren, you first.
Not much, actually. I've not been on the radio because I've been off for the holidays. But I will return to WFUV on Monday. That's January 6th. Monday the 6th, I'm back on normal hours, Monday through Thursday nights, starting at 10 p.m. till 2 a.m. and Saturday afternoons from 1 until 4 on WFUV, 90.7 FM in New York City. And the surrounding area, metropolitan area. If you're outside of that, or you're having reception problems at 90.7 FM, you can listen at WFUV.org or get our app. Another way you can listen, another convenient way, and look for me on Facebook. 2 pages I have, Darren Devivo and Darren Devivo, WFUV DJ and Beatle podcaster is the other page. And that's my deal.
Okay. Allan, how about you?
Well, mainly I've just been doing interviews about Legacy. And just Google it and some of them will turn up. And yeah, that's been fun. And you can contact me on Facebook, either at Allan Kozinn or Allan Kozinn Remixed. You can write to all of us at Things We Said Today radio show at gmail.com. The same address that you would send your contest entries to. You can follow us on, well, we're still on Twitter at Things We Said Fab. I've posted some of our shows on Blue Sky, but just on my account. I suppose we should start a Blue Sky page, And of course, we have our Facebook page, Things We Said Today video podcast, which is the first place that you'll find any of the shows posted. They're on YouTube, they're on Podbeam, Podbeam distributes to lots of other places like iHeartRadio and Apple Podcasts. So really, any place you get your podcasts, we're probably there. Anyway, that's it for me.
Okay. As for me, if you want to get in touch with me, my email address is everylittlething@att.net. We have a contest here giving away the McCartney Legacy Volume 2, and as we said, 3 copies we're giving away. There's another way you can win that book. And that's on my website because I have my Beatles trivia, which happens at the moment every other week, and it's listed as a prize. And so is the McCartney Legacy Volume 1. You can pick and choose between the two and 8 other prizes that are on there. And all you got to do is go to kenmichaelsradio.com, click on the Beatles Trivia and Games page, and it's one of 10 prizes that you can find on there. And figure out the answer to my Beatles trivia, and one lucky person will win whatever prize they pick of those 10. Okay, that's at kenmichaelsradio.com. My other podcast, Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles video cast. The most recent show that we did was on the box set for Living in the Material World. We are taking a little breather at the moment, and we'll be back sometime soon in the new year. And I'm sure we got a lot of great shows up ahead. And on my own YouTube channel, Ken Michaels Radio, most recently I did an interview with Billy J. Kramer for his new album, Are You With Me? There'll be lots of new shows coming very soon. And I do believe that's it. So at this time, I just want to, first of all, thank all of you. I'm not going to say it like I did last year for just being fans. No. Um, Thank all of you for your support of this show. It means a lot to us, whether you watch us on YouTube or any of the audio platforms that we're on. If you have any ideas at all for any topic you'd like for us to cover, please write to us. Like we said, our email address is things we said today radio show at gmail.com. Thanks to all the fantastic guests that we've had in the past year. And thanks to all of you who have supported our other work, like Talk More Talk and my YouTube channel and Two Legs and all the other offshoots. I like to think of us all as one network, and we really appreciate you being there for us. And this has been a tremendous year. I'm looking forward to a lot of things next year. Ringo's new album, hopefully Paul's new album, and who knows what else. Certainly sounds like there's going to be some Lennon stuff, whether it's a Walls and Bridges box set or something
Mhm.
for the one-to-one concert, which Sean has hinted at. Uh, Danny's talked about Peter Jackson working on the concert for Bangladesh, the video for that. So who knows what's in store? And then, of course, what's there going to be on the group? Are we finally going to get Rubber Soul for its 60th anniversary? We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah.
Should be a very interesting year for us fans. So I just want to thank you all once again for being here for us. And I want to wish you all a very happy new year,
Yep.
very new year for
Very new year. And we will see you next year with our next show, which will be part two of the McCartney Legacy, Volume 2, 1974 to 80.
And for Allan and Darren and myself, I'm Ken Michaels, and I'll see you all same time next year.
Take care, everyone. Happy New Year.